Welcome, everyone. I've been really looking forward to this particular Voices with Vervaeke. You're no doubt looking at somebody who many of you have heard me mention multiple times. And I cite his work and his influence repeatedly, huge impact on me, and somebody I've gotten to know on a somewhat more personal level. We were colleagues. I taught his son at one point, multiple points, I think, he's just a fantastic and I think important thinker in the field of cognitive science. I think he's probably one of the most premier, if not the premier person representing what's called 4E Cog Sci. That I think is very pertinent to questions that we're wrestling with around the nature of meaning, etc. So I'm going to just turn things over to my friend Evan Thompson and ask him to give us a little bit more of the background that he thinks might be relevant, and then we'll move to the issue at hand.
Yeah, so I am first and foremost a philosopher. That's my academic training, and I work in the areas of philosophy of mind and cognitive science, both theoretical cognitive science and collaborating with experimental scientists. I also have a strong interest in Asian philosophy. My undergraduate training was in Asian studies, Chinese language and history, and I got drawn into philosophy really through studying Chinese philosophy. So I sort of went the reverse path from the path that sometimes people take from west to east, or, from east to west in my case academically. But I have a continuing interest in the conversation between Asian philosophical traditions and Western philosophy. And I also have a strong interest in phenomenology, the tradition coming from Edmund Husserl. And that plays a strong role. The phenomenological tradition plays a strong role in the most recent book, The Blind Spot.
Which is what we're going to turn to. And Evan just referred to it, and this is it. I want to strongly recommend this book, especially for people who are interested in the meaning crisis. It is the central topic of this book. It is called The Crisis in Meaning, The Meaning Crisis, The Blind Spot. The Blind Spot is a particular account and explanation of the meaning crisis. This book is written with Adam Frank, Marcello Gleiser, is it Gleiser?
Gleiser, Marcello Gleiser, yeah.
And Evan Gleiser. Thompson is the third author. And so when I got this book, I opened it and I was like, whoa, things that are near and dear to my heart and to my work and my besetting obsessions. The meaning crisis was there. And then there's this notion of the blind spot, which we'll unpack in a minute. And I turn to chapter 9 on cognition, as I often do in any book, because that's my shtick. And the blind spot in cognition was explicitly named as relevance realization, something else near and dear to my heart. And so as soon as I saw that, I hadn't read any more of the book. I just read about 10 pages here and looked at the chapter and I went, oh, wow. And I showed my partner the book and I was like so excited about it. So I reached out to Evan right away and I said, you got to come on. We got to talk about this. Your work and my work really talk to each other really deeply at this point. The book, just some basic things. The book is wonderful. I'm talking now sort of rhetorically. It's clearly written. It's accessible. I wouldn't say it's like a beach read, like you're just going to sit there and write. You have to put thought into it. It provokes and demands reflection and consideration. But it is also not pitched to the academic hoi polloi or anything like that. It is really written as I think it should be, given the topic, to a general educated audience of people who are concerned with the meaning crisis and how we get here and what it is and what is this meaning we're talking about and how can we ameliorate it. So first of all, the book is really wonderfully written, very clear. Now, the thing I want to actually very quickly about and unpack this a little bit before we get into the meat of it. Like this book has a very single voice to it. Sometimes, when you're reading books by multiple authors, you get the sense of a cacophony and it's, but and you use we throughout and everything. You're reminding the reader constantly, as you should. But the voice has, I find the clear integrated voice. Like, how did that come about and how did you make that happen?
Well, I'm glad that it reads that way. Obviously, that was a challenge in writing a book with three authors, and I would say that the responsibility for really doing the overall smoothing, as we called it, and kind of unifying of tone and narrative, that was really part of my role as the writer. Each chapter was written in a first draft initially by one of the three of us. So Adam Frank, took the lead on the quantum mechanics chapter. Marcelo Gleister took the lead on the cosmology chapter. I took the lead on the cognition, consciousness, and the introduction chapters. But then we each, wrote over each other's drafts. And then when we felt that we all were sort of on the same page with regard to what we were saying, then it was really my job to smooth it out and just give it a unified voice and tone, which I'm happy to hear you say you think it works, because when you're doing something like that, you don't want to remove the particular the special things that each author has in the way they articulate something, the way they write something. You don't want to just remove that and flatten things. But on the other hand, you can't have really very different styles in the same chapter, let alone the same book. So that definitely took some work. But I enjoyed that work, actually. I found it very satisfying, and it enabled me to really deeply think through each chapter with materials that I'm not an expert on. Quantum mechanics, cosmology, the physics of time. I mean, these are not my areas of expertise. I have an interest in them from a philosophy of science angle, but that's not to be a scientist in those areas. So I learned a lot from doing that.
Well, that's interesting, and I won't open this up as a rabbit hole, although maybe we'll return to it. I mean, I've been doing a lot of work right now on dialogical reason as opposed to monological reason, and a lot of the emerging evidence about how it has a lot of capacities to overcome bias and to be more clear and complex at the same time that you get with monological. So I welcome that the fact that this was sort of dialogically produced. So in order to flesh that out a little bit more, can you tell me a little bit more about Adam and Marcello?
Yeah, so Adam Frank is an astronomer and astrophysicist at the University of Rochester. He works on a number of different things in science, and he's written a number of more general audience books. Marcelo Gleiser is a theoretical physicist, and he's also done a number of different things in the scientific domains, as well as having written a number of popular books. So the way that we wound up writing this book is that Marcelo directed for, I think, about 5 or 6 years at Dartmouth College, where he's based, an Institute for Cross-Disciplinary Engagement, ICE. And he invited fellows each year to come and be there for a couple of weeks and give some talks and just interact with the community there. And he invited Adam and me, I think it would have been 2016 or 2017, I don't remember. So we were both there together, and we just started talking. And at one point in our conversations about, science and experience, this term, the blind spot, sort of popped into our conversation. And then we just kept sort of working on it, the three of us. And eventually it became clear that, we had something that we wanted to write. So it really came out of conversations, our collaboration, as a result of Marcelo's having this kind of special intellectual setting where he was inviting scientists and philosophers and historians and religious teachers, spiritual teachers as well, also to the center. And so their background is really coming out of physics and history of science. And then the conversation between us was what launched the book.
That's excellent. So there's good representation both from the history and the philosophy of science going into this book.
Yeah.
So I want you to unpack the core argument. Now, and people do this to me all the time. Can you summarize the awakening from the meaning crisis?
Right.
So, and we'll give you time and space, but when you do that, though, can you talk a little bit about how at least these figures show up in the introduction? They show up sort of throughout, but Nishida and Whitehead and then Cartwright. three philosophers, at least that's
Yeah.
maybe the best category they all belong to, are playing a pivotal role. Cartwright, I'm unfamiliar with. I've just purchased a couple of her books because of The Blind Spot, so thank you for that. And Whitehead and Nishida, I'm doing a lot of work on, and I've been doing this on and off for several years. But I mean, they have a notion about this idea that in some way, I'll use Whitehead's idea here. We've gotten into kind of a performative contradictions where we're making statements about reality. And then I'll use Nishida from a standpoint that isn't consistent with those statements. And many people on watching my channel are familiar. I've made this argument about scientists making pronouncements about everything above the level of the quantum being an illusion. And then it's like, but then you're basing those statements on all these illusory machines and gauges and illusory conferences and conference. Like, what? How are you drawing deep conclusions about the ultimate nature of reality from all this illusory material? And there's a performative contradiction. I don't know if this is the actual source, but I credit Whitehead was sort of the first person to like really put his finger on that performative contradiction. Although I see Nishida doing something very similar, especially when he gets to Basho, when he's talking about Basho. So, what is the argument, and why the term the blind spot, which I found really helpful as an enacted, almost an enacted metaphor for this.
Right. So maybe we'll start with the metaphor of the blind spot. So the blind spot, in the way that we're using the term, is a metaphor from the blind spot in the visual field that we have, that all mammals have, actually. And it's the area of the retina where the optic nerve leaves and projects, inward into the brain. And because there are no light sensitive receptor cells where that bundle of nerve fibers enters into the brain, we don't see anything in the blind spot. There's no possibility of visual sensitivity to what's in the blind spot, but we also don't see that we have a blind spot because it's the situation is the eyes are constantly darting about and the blind spots of the two eyes are different. And so we, as it is said, we sort of fill in across the blind spot. So we have a blind spot, an area within the visual field in which we don't see, and we don't see that we don't see. So this is a metaphor for the idea that in our scientific worldview, there is something that makes science possible, that is you could say the source of science, but we don't see it, and we don't see that we don't see it. And what it is, and now we could use different words for this, what it is lived experience, direct experience, immediate intuition, pure awareness, these terms that that thinkers like William James and Kitaro Nishida, and also figures in literature in the 19th, turn of the 20th century, are interested in stream of consciousness. All of these thinkers, as modern science is becoming this tremendously powerful epistemic accomplishment, all of these thinkers are Whitehead, Husserl, the phenomenologists. They're all grappling with this recognition that there is an experiential source to our knowledge that we systematically occlude when we think about the nature of that knowledge. And the way that we do that, it takes different forms, but the way that we do that in how we think about science is that we step back, we look for invariance across perspectives, we look for things that we can objectify and quantify across a community of observers, forgetting that those things actually depend on and arise out of a background of lived experience. And then we objectify them in a way where we take them to be more fundamental than the experience that underpins them. And that's the sort of crucial move in what we call the blind spot, is this treatment of what comes about through a certain method. Let's call it a method of objectification, which is a very powerful and very useful method. We're not arguing against the method as such. But when you forget that it's a method and you take it for the being of what you're studying in a way that makes that being more fundamental than the experience that's animating the method, then what you've done is, and here we really rely on Husserl in The Crisis of European Science, you substitute a method for being, which is like a category error, and Husserl calls this the surreptitious substitution. Mm-hmm. You substitute a method that you've arrived at. Husserl identifies it as arising really most powerfully in Galileo, where Galileo, imagines the world with no sentient creatures. He then treats nature as math in terms of mathematizable properties, where the mathematizable properties, the method for him is geometry. The mathematizable properties are then taken to be the actual being and reality of the universe from a sort of God's eye point of view that sees the language in which nature is written. So that move of substituting a method for being, that's the surreptitious substitution that's built into the blind spot. And the connection to Whitehead is that Whitehead, there's sort of two concepts in Whitehead that are important for us. And for Whiteheadians out there, I would say that we're really working here from what is sometimes called Whitehead's middle period. So the concept of nature is a really important book for us. And also Science in the Modern World, which is a little bit later. So Whitehead says there's, in the epistemology that gets attached to modern science, or to natural philosophy, you could say, there's a bifurcation of nature.
You're right.
Where we say, as Galileo did, what's objective and fundamentally real are the mathematizable properties, and the qualities, the lived experience, that's subjective. And in a way, it gets kicked outside of nature. That's the bifurcation. It gets kicked outside because if nature is that which is mathematizable, and those qualities have to be removed in order to mathematize nature, then what are you going to do with those qualities that are residing, as it were, in the mind? Well, the mind then gets excised from nature. And Whitehead is, insistent on saying, even from the standpoint of natural philosophy, you cannot do that because the lived sensuous qualities belong to nature. And so the task is to create a system of relations that that treats them on the same sort of level playing field and integrates them. And to think that the abstractions, the mathematical abstractions, are what nature really is, Whitehead calls that the fallacy of misplaced concreteness. Because you've got an abstraction that you concretize. And no, what's concrete is, in Whitehead's terms, it's the sensuous experience or the sense awareness in which nature is given to us in terms of passage and duration and flow, out of which we abstract things like space-time continuum and so on. So that's sort of what we set up in the beginning of the book, where the blind spot, just to maybe succinctly summarize it, the blind spot is the inability to see or to recognize or to acknowledge that lived experience is the source of science. And so if you undercut the source of science by occluding lived experience, this is central to our argument, you're actually damaging science, because you're removing the epistemic footing that it needs to be the kind of powerful investigative method it is. And what happens is you get this, symptomatic of the meaning crisis and our culture, you get this oscillation between the extreme of science triumphalism, which is science is the greatest method ever and the world is what science tells us it is, on the one hand. And then you get science denial on the other hand, because a very natural reaction to science triumphalism is to say, well, that's not how I experience the world, regardless of what you say. And in a world of rapid transmission of information and misinformation and willful, misleading of people, that oscillation between science triumphalism and science denial becomes particularly problematic and pernicious. So that's sort of the setup of the book at the very beginning.
That was great. And that oscillation is, it also comes to the fore in some ways. In some, it I don't know if it's the same, but it resonates with the oscillation. We have an instability in our sense of realness. We have these two, right? We have the mathematical sense of realness, and Descartes played with both to no resolution, or we have this the core where consciousness is present to itself as what is most real, and we also vacillate between those. And I don't know if they are identical, but at least they seem to be tracking also between science triumphalism and science denialism. I thought that was beautiful. So it sounds like and this is a bit of Nishida in it, you're picking up on that the blind spot, we're not only unaware of it, but it is also simultaneously the source of our ability to see.
Yeah, that's
right. Right. Because the optic, right, and and Nishitani builds on this. It's the not the thing that makes it accessible to us, and that sort of thing.
Right.
So that move is really interesting to me. This idea of grounding, and you use that term a couple of times. In Source, you use that term a lot. So what would you say to somebody who says, well, what do you mean? I mean, isn't there a difference between the epistemological order of how I come to knowledge and the ontological order of what that knowledge discloses? Yeah, I have to start in sense experience and et cetera, but that doesn't mean that that ordering of my epistemological endeavor is the same as the order of reality or how it unfolds. I know that you're ready for this, but I want to hear what you have to say about this.
Sure. Well, this depends on what ordering means. So, I mean, at one level, it certainly is something that needs to be recognized, that the procedure by which we disclose something is one thing, and that which is disclosed is another thing. The ordering, though, if it's a hierarchical ordering in terms of fundamentality, goes beyond just that recognition, because it says what's ontologically fundamental is, let's say, the mathematizable, the properties as mathematizable, and the experience is derivative. The problem with that ordering is that the mathematizable properties exist at a different level of intelligibility from the concrete phenomena. And they are, if you will, the map, and the territory is the concrete phenomena. And if you assume that the territory just is the particular map in the way that you're able to render it using the tools of objectification and mathematics, that's actually to not see that. So let me give a concrete illustration, because this is a very abstract way of putting it. So one of the things we talk about is time,
right?
And so we have the idea that from the standpoint of physics, clock, time is what clocks measure. That's fine as a method. But if you then say, well, what time is what a clock measures, you've forgotten that there needs to be clock readers, and they exist in some window of duration that's a continuous flow that disappears if you try to reconstruct it in terms of point-like instance and clock readings. So
let me just interject here. So
go ahead.
I want to make sure I'm tracking. You're saying something like there's a kind of time in clock reading that is presupposed in measuring time with a clock.
Exactly.
If I could put it that way.
Exactly.
Is that okay?
Yeah. So there was just a review of The Blind Spot in LA Review of Books by Robert Crease, who's a philosopher of physics, also writes general books about science, and he had a wonderful statement that I wish we had actually thought of. And let me see if I can get it exactly. So he says, describing our view, no one pulls out a clock to know what time is. They pull out a clock to know what time it is. So that's basically the idea, right? You already have to have some experience of time, and you might say, sort of, to use a phenomenological term, a kind of pre-understanding of time, in order to be able to recognize a clock as at all relevant to the subject phenomenon that you're immersed in. So the ordering, just to go back to the ordering point. So the ordering is what we object to is the sort of hierarchical ordering in terms of fundamentality, where we say experience is not fundamental, or what's disclosed to us of the world in how we experience it is derivative, not fundamental. And what's fundamental is what we're able to reveal through, say, mathematical models.
Thank you for watching. This YouTube and podcast series is by the Vervaeke Foundation, which in addition to supporting my work, also offers courses, practices, workshops, and other projects dedicated to responding to the meaning crisis. If you would like to support this work, please consider joining our Patreon. You can find the link in the show notes. Okay, so there's two moves here, and I like both of them because I've advocated for both of them. So I hope this isn't just two members of the choir performing in front of the minister or something like that.
That's okay too.
Because I've talked about, even a naturalist should be committed not only to what is derivable from your science, but what is presupposed by the practice of your science.
Exactly.
And that's exactly what you seem to be saying here. Greg Enriquez and I talk about that as extended naturalism, right? And then the next one is, and this one may be maybe more controversial, but it sort of follows from the first. There's an implicit judgment of realness, and I think, well, I hope you agree. I take real as a comparative adjective, right? When Merleau-Ponty, people from Plato to Merleau-Ponty to Whitehead have said you only judge one thing as an illusion by judging something else as real. It's always comparative, and vice versa. And so what I was hearing something like fundamental, implying something like more real. And the idea is, I'm not happy with this terms and we'll play with them a little bit later, but the concrete is more real than the abstract because of something like, and you say this multiple times too, there's a richness, there's an inexhaustibleness to that, and this is the point about the map territory kind of, the territory is way richer, has an inexhaustible, it overflows any particular map, even a globe, even a Earth-sized globe, et cetera, et cetera. Is that?
Yeah,
and
sure.
That's very, so for me, just because we're sort of putting cards on the table, that's the influence of Polanyi on me. He was proposing that as the mark of what he calls contact with reality. And Esther Lightcap-Mead has talked about that in her book of the same title. This inexhaustibleness, but it's not cacophonous inexhaustible, and that we'll play with that a little bit. It's kind of like an inexhaustible fount of intelligibility, right?
Right.
And so is that landing?
Yeah.
There?
So that's very much it. I mean, another way that I think of it is that our being always is more than or overflows our knowing, because knowing happens through certain means, through certain methods, through certain sensory systems, through certain forms of intelligibility, and our being is always larger than that. It always overflows that. Yeah.
So that's wonderful, Evan. I've got to slow down. I'm very enthusiastic about it. So that means that. Well, let me form it as a question. Is it possible that because I've made an argument that one of the contributors to the meaning crisis is we've reduced many kinds of knowing that have many different kinds of memory attached to them, procedural, episodic, autonoetic, have different criteria of realness to them. Skill is power. Perspectival knowing is sort of like noticing, getting that sense of, getting deeper into things, more present to them. And then the participatory knowing is the sense of sort of belonging, fittedness to your environment. And what I mean by that is part of, I hear you saying this, but I want to frame it like we've reduced what knowing is, and we forgot when we do that, we've forgot the ultimate responsibility of knowing to being, like particularly our being, but also being in general. Like we forgot that there are ways of knowing that are more or are closer, metaphor, to our being in the world than these mathematical abstractions. Is that also tracking?
Oh, definitely. Yeah, no, definitely. Yeah. I think there are different kinds of knowing. There are different modes of knowing, I suppose you might say. Different ways of delineating those, of course, too. Yeah. And it's because science is so transformatively powerful. in its outward, obvious manifestations, we have defaulted to thinking, and I mean, you see this explicitly in Descartes, right? We've defaulted to thinking that knowing is a matter of having a method. And that's true for some methods of knowing. But even the application of a method presupposes something that you can't, state in terms of a method, right? I mean, this is a familiar kind of thing for philosophers. So yeah, no, that's right. There's a kind of acquaintance, you could say, that we have with our being that is not a matter of having a method. That acquaintance is not unproblematic, of course. I mean, all sorts of questions arise in relation to that, normative questions, existential questions, philosophical questions, ethical, political, of course. But it's the background for the application of any method. Exactly.
Well, I was smiling because, and I know you're aware of this because you tweeted about it, with Johannes Jaeger and Anna Riedel and Aldous Vervaeke and Dennis Walsh. We're trying to get a paper published on how you can't ultimately, you can't capture relevance realization in computation for exactly that reason, that the process of formalization, of translating things into a formal system, is always an ill-defined problem that requires relevance realization. And that sort of, I mean, there's a lot more to that paper, but that's the core kind of move.
No, I love that paper, and I completely agree and sympathize with the argument.
Now, what's interesting, excellent answer to that question. So I'm going to throw out these like devil's advocate things, and then you do this wonderful thing, and we get into some nice discussion. Well, somebody will say bifurcation. Come on, we've always bifurcated because we have to, and we do even in our lived experience, readily and reliably make distinctions between appearance and reality, fraud and reality, illusion and reality, delusion and reality, hallucination and reality, right? And yeah, maybe we cut it up as a subjective and objective, but the ancient world cut it up into the problem of the one and the many. We're always building these worldviews, trying to somehow give us a normative guide for how we discern, reality from appearance. And so isn't a bifurcation an inevitable thing, therefore?
Yeah. So, of course, we always live in a world where we have to make distinctions between the appearance of something and as we say, how it really is. But if we think about how that works, the test, the criterion, the standard for how something really is disclosed in and through another experience. So it's not that we step outside of experience and we have some absolute standard or metric by which we can say this is real and that isn't real. It's rather that we continually open up new vistas, new horizons in experience where the relationship between appearance and reality shifts within the sphere of experience itself. So that's not really bifurcation in Whitehead's sense. That's a sort of progressive changing of appearances, perspectives, profiles, aspects of things where what we take to be true or real is something disclosed again through experience, where Whitehead, when he uses the term bifurcation of nature, really means you kick experience out of the framework of scientific, the framework of the scientific representation of nature. And then, and we know this very well today in terms of the hard problem of consciousness, then you face a very, very fundamentally difficult problem of how to recover consciousness, awareness, the mind. And the hard problem is that problem. It's a problem that derives in a way from the bifurcation of nature, in the way that we state the problem today, which is, how is consciousness possible in a purely physical world, where we conceive the purely physical in terms of this bifurcation of, a mathematizable, quantitative nature that then somehow we have to find a room for the qualia, the qualitative properties, the phenomenality, the appearances. And then we do that by either trying to, be reductionist and say, well, it just really is physicality in the face of the obvious sort of problem of conceptual intelligibility there. Or we say, well, it actually is an illusion itself. We sort of go the illusionist route, and then we strain at the intelligibility of the concept of an illusion. Or we go panpsychist and we say, well, there's a sense in which consciousness in some minimal phenomenal sense is sort of an ingredient everywhere at all levels. So we sort of like, having sucked the consciousness out, we then sort of like spray it back into the universe, as it were, everywhere. And that doesn't really work either. So that's the bifurcation. So yes, of course, we have to make distinctions between appearance and reality, genuine, counterfeit. But we always do that within a framework of the test of experience.
So that's the key move. And I like that. That was a great answer. And there was a moment in the book, sorry, I don't mean to indicate it was the only moment in the book. There was one moment in the book, one among many, where I was looking at this and I thought, oh, I never put those two together. I talk obviously about, the relationship to God and the two worlds of mythology, but you made this move where you said, the thing about the idea of this, I don't know what to call it, the monarchical God or something like that. God, even when that God disappeared, we preserved the placeholder function of the view from nowhere, right, in there. And so what I hear you critiquing is that view from nowhere possibility. It's like, yes, there's reality, illusion, reality distinctions, but you never are in the place from nowhere, no when, to make that distinction. Is that a
that's
fair
right.
way?
That's right. Exactly. I mean, if you read Newton or Galileo, you have this conception, a particular kind of conception of God as able to, behold everything at all times from all possible perspectives. Newton says that, space is God's sensorium. So there's a sense in which God can contemplate, every possible perspective of a thing in space. You have a conception of the outside view, and science, it may never achieve that, but that's its ideal in a way. And so that is very much what we're criticizing, is that's not how science works, and it's not how knowledge works. It's not how experience works.
So that's really good, and I want to shift back into Nishida just for a sec. I forget where it's in Nishida, but Carter talks about it in his beautiful book, The Nothingness Beyond God. He talks about Nishida's distinction between the transcendent and the immanent transcendent.
Right.
Right. Because you qualified something, and I think it was good that you did, because some of my people listening to this, you're not the village atheist or something like that. That's not what's being argued for here. And I hear you're saying, well, that conception, the transcendent, that is probably, given this argument, a performative contradiction of some kind. Like it's ultimately not conceivable to us, not just because we're limited or finite, but because it is inherently, it severs itself from the very sources of meaning and understanding. Is that a fair proposal?
That is, yeah. Whereas
there's something like the notion of the immanent transcendence, which you get, of course, in Whitehead. Right, you have the emergence, right? You have, and we can talk about whether or not you still like this language, but you have the eternal and the emergent, and they're constantly resonating with each other, but they're always bound together. Whitehead says, God transcends the world to the same degree that the world transcends God, and God is immanent in the world to the same degree the world is immanent in God. And I think that's very aligned with what Nishida is trying to get at. Now, you aren't responsible to every possible audience. I get that. But a lot of people come to this, and I think this is a fair point, around the meaning crisis, and they come to this around the issue of sacredness, because they say, yes, you're talking about reality, and you're talking about things can be more real. I can be closer. I can be more in conformity to it. I can live perhaps a fuller life, a more responsible life. And there's a sense that could even be sacred. It could afford transforming me, making me a better person. And, both Whitehead has a God, and Nishida talks a lot about God, and he certainly has a sacred in it. I know you're not a theologian, and I'm not trying to bend you into something, but I think this is a fair question, because these questions around the meaning crisis bring up issues around, about sacredness and ultimacy, and what would you say about that? Would you say that, yeah, because there's a parallel. This is all final proposal before I shut up and let you answer the question. There's a parallel with religious denial and religious triumphalism, I think, in a certain way, and maybe and you're trying to get out of the one, and I agree with you on that. The science, and I've been trying to get out of the other, and I'm wondering if you see relationship between them, particularly because and I want to get into this with you at some point. I think this meaning, what psychologists call meaning in life, not semantic meaning, but this sense of connectedness to reality, is what's behind, our judgments of what is, most real and most sacred, most important for us, etc. Do you think those two problems talk to each other? I know you don't. I haven't read the whole book. Maybe you talk about it in other places in the book, but what do you think about it?
Yeah, no, those are really interesting thoughts and questions. That definitely goes beyond what we talk about in the book. So we don't. I mean, I'm happy to talk about it here, but just to be clear about the book, it's not. We don't really enter into issues about, you might say, larger issues about meaning that connect to religion or to the sacred or to spirituality. We maybe allude to the certain aspects of them here and there, but they're not a really dominant theme in the book. The book is really circumscribed by the effort to help us get clear about what science is and how science works. But that, of course, immediately raises the question from a larger perspective of how to think about science in relationship to philosophy or religion, or to issues about the sacred. This is difficult, in a way, to know exactly how to enter, because the word sacred can mean different things. The word God can mean different things. Like Whitehead has a very idiosyncratic conception of God. I mean, it's been generative for process theology, but it's an outlying conception, even within the realm of theology. So
maybe I can propose to you how I'm using it, and maybe and see if that's good enough. And I'm deeply influenced here by a fellow Canadian, Schellenberg, and his idea of the triple transcendent. The sacred is that which is, in some sense, ultimately real for us. It is ultimately transformative for us. It has a soteriological function. It's not just an intellectual assent. And then it has an axiological. It serves as kind of an ultimate normative guide for us in some way in making our ethical and aesthetic, even epistemological judgments. And other people like Bracken and the Divine Matrix seem to be arguing for that. I'm not saying this is going to satisfy everybody, but maybe it's enough of a core so that we got something to work with in answering the question I'm posing to you.
Yeah. I guess the way that I have been thinking about that recently, so that this isn't really worked out for me in a thorough way, but I have thought about these things, more actually in relation to the writings that I've done about Buddhism and religion and science in my earlier book, Why I'm Not a Buddhist. So there's an issue, I would say, about...
and you're going to come on my show and talk to me about that book when I get to that book. I've had that book on my shelf for a while, and I apologize for that. But
yeah, no worries. Yeah, no, that would be fun. So we might use Tillich's idea of faith as ultimate concern, not to say that it has to stop there, but we can take that idea as an entry point.
I like Tillich a lot, as you know. He's a big influence on me.
Yeah. So ultimate concern, or we could use the word sacred to mean ultimate concern as well. So faith, sacred, ultimate concern. For me, one issue really has to do with a juxtaposition between what Martin Hagelin calls secular faith. So this is the idea of faith in our being, as faith in our finitude, faith in the life we share together as finite beings, under the horizon of death, or within the the limit of the horizon of death. A kind of existential secular conception of ultimate concern, where ultimate concern really has to be grounded in this life and this world that we share with each other.
Good. Okay.
Whereas the notion of transcendence can be used in a way that would be juxtaposed to that, where transcendence would mean something like a state either of liberation or freedom or release that takes us beyond or outside this life. Transcendence doesn't have to be used that way, because you could have a transcendence in immanence again within this, within this life. But when used that way, which I think is one fundamental sense of transcendence we see running through lots of different religious traditions, then I don't see. It's not that I want to deny that, because I think for many people that's important and meaningful, but it wouldn't be how I would articulate the sacred or ultimate concern.
Right. Yeah. And so there's I've realized I've made an error sometimes in making this a hard and fast distinction. It's more of a continuum, but there is a distinction to be made between something being indispensable to somebody and somebody claiming it's sort of metaphysically necessary in some fashion. The example I use is I'm monolingual, so English is indispensable to my cognitive agency. That doesn't mean it's metaphysically necessary. And so I think that's how I sort of parse what you're doing. And I agree with you. The sacred does not obligate us to any kind of escapism, because behind the escapism is a two worlds mythology, and then we have the problem of the bifurcation, and then we're getting back to the very place we're trying to get from. And I agree with that. That's a mistake. But so for example, the meaning in life literature. You want to ask people if they have meaning in life. You ask them these three questions, and what do you want to exist even if you don't?
Sorry, say that question again.
What do you want to exist even if you don't?
Right. Yeah. Okay.
How real is it? And sometimes you put in the qualifier, how really real is it? Because some people, what do you mean? All right. And then how much of a difference do you make to it right now? If you got something, and it doesn't have to be an object, obviously. If you have something that, this is Susan Wolf's, this is trying to, break out into a questionnaire, Susan Wolf's idea of being connected to something larger than yourself, right? Yeah. What that metaphor means is, well, people want this thing, like they want it to be in the universe, even if they're not. It's not in any way bound to their egocentric preferences, right? And then the next one is, it can't be fraudulent, it can't be mere appearance, it can't be superficial, it has to have significance and depth, and then the next is, but we have to be connected to it. We have to make a difference to it. And so remember, I agree with everything you said, and I sort of ran through the argument with you about it. But how do you, I'm going to express sympathy. I can express, and let me buttress this. Okay. So you're in the Axial revolution. You've got Bella's second order thinking. Your metacognition has been massively improved by numeracy, with what the Greeks are doing with alphabetic literacy. You've got incipient democracy, so debate is everywhere, and hyper justification, and you've got a shared culture, but many different policies. So you have all this social experimentation, and this is really blowing your metacognitive abilities up, right? And so you're getting just a tremendous awareness of your capacities for self-deception. And then you're liable to think, and you can see this in Plato. You can even see it outside of Greece. You can see it like in the Dhammapada, but and things like this. That this realization about how much of our suffering and violence is due to this self-deceptive proclivity of the mind, and then you could start to conceive of a world that, how the world would be if you weren't looking at it through that torture of self-deception and self-destruction. And then you could plug into this other thing we said. You've got being connected to that is deeply meaningful to you, and you somehow have a sense of it being beyond your life, right, and beyond your egocentric concerns. And so I'm not justifying. I'm trying to play with an explanation with you. It's very tempting to give into a two worlds mythology. That is just such a wonderful way of explaining all of that and drawing it together.
Sure. Yeah, no, that's right. And I think, there are different cultural forms that takes. So,
yes, of course. Yes.
Say in India, where in the Vedas we don't really see the idea of rebirth or reincarnation, as we sometimes say. We have a cosmology in which there may be higher, more divine kind of transformative states or possibilities after death that have to do with divinities and the sort of sacred order of the cosmos. And then we have this idea that we have this sort of ethicization of action, where the idea is, if you act, in a good way, then, the possibility of a more refined, transformative after death state is open to you. If you act in a bad way, then it's going to go worse for you after death. And so we have this sort of, you could say, kind of two world, if we slice it in terms of, life here and what happens after death. And then we have the idea that of karma that we see really first in the Upanishads, where it's because of desire, you're actually thrown back from that other world into this world, and then it goes round and round and round, and that becomes an existential problem that has to be solved. And then we get the different solutions to it on the part of Buddhism and the Buddha's teachings, or what later come to be called Hindu teachings. So that's all part of this axial transformation in our consciousness, in our metacognition, in our cosmology, in our ethics, definitely. And
let me phrase the question. Since we've landed on sort of I like the way you broadened it, because I want the cross-contextual, cross-historical, right? Given that something like that, like that, how do we preserve the recognizable gains? There's a change in the notion of wisdom to like you said, this kind of liberation, maybe escape, but transformation from maybe a Bronze Age. Taylor talks about the continuous cosmos, and you're trying to fit in and harmonize, right? It's a very different notion of wisdom. How do we preserve what was gained by us? And I'm going to obviously ask the same thing when we come to the scientific revolution. Right. How do we preserve what was gained by the axial revolution? Well, can we preserve that? Let's say we agree we want to preserve it. I'm presuming here, but let's say we want to preserve a lot of what was gained by that, all the metacognitive enhancements, all the sense of individual responsibility, right, etc. The realization of self-deception, the possibility of self-correction. How do we maintain all of that? Or can we? I'll phrase it as a question. Better question. Can we maintain all of that and, I don't know, tear it free? And I'm trying to use a somewhat violent metaphor, from the two worlds of mythology. I mean, it's almost, and part of this also plugs into even our conceptual metaphors and our embodiment. Real is more up, less real is down, and like, I'm feeling up today and you're looking down, and all this kind of language, and we abstract, and the abstract is above and the concrete is like it's so woven culturally, and even like into plugs into our embodiment in a powerful way. I think we can, but I want to hear what you like. Do you perceive the difficulty of the problem?
Oh, certainly. I mean, that is a huge question. You might say a part of the big historical question for our times, and the the crisis of meaning that we face, as you've talked about it. And I see it. It's hard not to sort of go Hegelian here, but I'm going to give in to the temptation. I see it in a way as that was a hugely transformative revolution, let's call it, the axial revolution. And we might also think that things were lost in that. So we might think that a certain relationship to the natural world was lost. And we're now especially conscious of the need to restore some viable, I'll even say sustainable, though it's become a buzzword, some viable, sustainable relationship between the human and the rest of the biosphere that requires, I think, an affirmation of the specialness of our Earth environment. Yes, so Marcelo Gleiser's book, The Dawn of a Mindful Universe, is about this. It's, yes, there are, inordinately many planets out there that might be able to support life, but a critical examination also suggests that there might actually be very, very few that have life. And if life is a special thing that's happened here, at least in the way that it's happened here, then, the sacred and ultimate concern has to involve our being in relationship to the biosphere. And we have to do it in a way that involves all of the ethical cognitive gains that we made, as it were, from the Axial revolution, telescoping, huge historical time here. But we also have to do it in a way that recovers a kind of sensibility to and relationship to the natural world that would have been pre-agricultural, at least according to some historical narratives. We can't go back to that, of course, that's absurd. But we need to recover something of that in a new. So the way this is Hegelian is it's like a higher turn of the spiral. This would be how my dad would have put it, actually, is that, you have this a recursi of history, and you never repeat the same thing, but there are patterns where at a certain turning of the spiral, you actually can look down and see, the axial turn, the turn that would have been, or the curve that would have been before the axial. And from that perspective, you need to recover things that were lost, because there's always something lost as well when you have a gain. And the amazing thing about science, just to bring it back to the book for a moment, is that with things like the Gaia theory and Earth system science, we've opened up a whole new appreciation of that we don't live on the planet, we live in the planet, that we're embedded at so many levels in the very fabric of life on the planet. And that is to really be with that in an ethical way requires a kind of profound, I think, change in our sensibility that science gives us some of the tools for, not all of them, but some of them. And the other things are going to need to come from, larger perspectives of ethics and the sacred, religion and spirituality, art. I mean, the world is a lot bigger than science, right? The human cultural world. Yeah.
Well, that brings up two things. One is, of course, I assume you're making a similar argument about the scientific revolution, that there was a lot lost. I mean, that's what the book is saying.
That's right.
In some ways.
That's right.
But you're not proposing nostalgia. I get that.
Definitely not.
And so, but the thing you said about that so it's not only a looking back through the eyes of history, it's also looking around through eyes other than the eyes of science, art, ritual, all different ways of knowing, different ways of being together, of being in the world, looking from within, not looking at, but looking from within nature. Ursula Goodenough's notion of transcendence into nature, things like that. And so Whitehead had this idea that we need to recover, almost in Tolkien's sense of recover, we need to recover art and ritual and all of this, and somehow bring it back into having a proper role within our epistemological and ontological endeavors. That's clearly sort of a thing that Whitehead is arguing. Does that land for you too?
Okay, definitely. So definitely.
Okay. And here's where we're maybe trespassing on Matt's work, Matt Segal, especially in his most recent book. But and this is where I'm influenced somewhat by Habermas, right? Kant basically severs the true and the good and the beautiful from each other in really powerful ways with the three critiques and the autonomy arguments for each one of those. And Kant is sort of looming in places in the book here and there, because you're rejecting both a kind of old Platonism and simple Kantianism about things like math. We'll probably get into that in the next conversation. I don't know if we'll get to it now, but I'm trying to get at what would, at least in a preliminary fashion, and I'm not trying to pin you here. I'm your friend. I want to talk to you about this. How would you address? I mean, that's a hard problem. It's a hard problem. I mean, Habermas has been wrestling with it. He wrestled with it. Sorry, to overcoming those arguments that give us the autonomy of the true, the good, and beautiful. We have a sense. David Schindler's been arguing about how they're actually convertible and all that sort of stuff. But how would you? Where would you go to? Like I'm trying to make I'm trying to make Kant the impediment that you have to address right
Okay.
now. but
Yeah.
not all of his work, but just this move about, right, the you know the separation and making autonomous, and including making the individual autonomous with each one of within each one of these autonomies of, because of the three critiques.
Mm.
That seems to me like a really powerful thing to be trying to wrestle with philosophically, and the book has a philosophical edge to it. You represent that.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I hadn't quite thought of it in those Kantian terms. I suppose my philosophical sensibility is so informed by phenomenology in the sort of sense coming from Husserl, and it doesn't. There's a way of talking about truth where it's very easy to think of truth as different from the beautiful, say. And that's
Right.
because we think of truth in terms of the correctness of propositions, and we have
Right.
an idea of correctness, really, or of correspondence. But from a phenomenological perspective, that actually is a secondary sense of truth, and the primary sense of truth is disclosure or presence, or to be technical in the way that Husserl uses the terminology, the evidencing of something. So evidencing is we use evidence as a noun in English. We think here's a piece of evidence, but in other languages, evidencing has this verbal sense where you disclose something, you uncover it, you reveal it, it comes to presence. Heidegger tries to talk about this in terms of his sort of etymological reconstruction of the Greek sense of unconcealment, of aletheia. Letheia is the concealment, the alpha privative aletheia is the unconcealment. So there's this opening, this space of unconcealment and openness, and it's within that space that you can then say, in terms of a proposition you might assert, that you put in quotation marks, oh, that proposition that you just said is correct. That happens against this other sense of truth, which is unconcealment, presence, openness, evidence, disclosure, however you want to put it. So within that context, it's very difficult to make a separation between the sense of truth as unconcealment and, say, the beautiful, or other aesthetic properties, for that matter, or the just. And so if we think of it that way, we are, in a sense, going back before Kant. You might say, well, that's going back before the critical philosophy of Kant, and thinking in a more Greek way. That's fine, as long as we do it having taken the knowledge and the message, if we want to simplify things, of Kant on board. It's we're not going back in some nostalgic way, in the way that Heidegger often writes, in a way that I find actually very distasteful. This kind of nostalgic, artificial German romantic sort of projection back into the ancient world. No, we're not doing that. We're taking what we've learned from Kant, but we're moving forward in the way that, say, phenomenologists have taught us to do, where, again, the let's say the horizon of experience as presence is the context within which we're going to be talking, where those distinctions can't be made hard and fast in the way that they might have been done,
right,
for the Kantian purposes.
I want to play with that a little bit. I like that, because I've done similar play. Ricoeur talks about the hermeneutics of suspicion, and I've made the argument the hermeneutics of suspicion is parasitic on what I call the hermeneutics of beauty. The hermeneutics of suspicion is appearances are distorting, misleading, they conceal deception, blah blah. But the hermeneutics of beauty, at least way some people are talking about beauty, is, well, no, but there have to be situations in which appearances disclose reality. That appearance is not a veil, right? That's an enlightenment ideal, and that beauty is when we're getting a sense, and Scary does this in her book on beauty, that it's we're getting a sense of it's bound up with almost like that insight moment where you realize, I haven't been seeing this as it is, and then so that's beauty, but then that you're already also in like the truth, but you're also getting into this other thing, this sort of, and you get this research from people who have look at the Griffith Lab and others. I know you're familiar with this research, and they have the experience, the noetic experience of the really real, and it seems to have a kind of normativity to them,
Mm-hmm.
right? Right. And it's just in the fact that it's real that it's normatively binding on them, like, and they transform their lives and their relationships, and they're not guided by at least a Kantian sense of being more moral, and they're not right, but they're guided, but nevertheless by this sense of a goodness. I call it ontonormativity, just to give a name to it. Somehow there's a goodness to reality that, and you're nodding, or maybe you might be just being polite, but is that sort of the kind of thing you're talking about, where you start to unpack these kind of things and you start to say, well, no, there's a sense of beauty as appearances disclosing something underneath them, which relates to truth as disclosure. And then there's a sense of goodness as, this contact with the really real as something that's sort of an normativity for us. Is that?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, I think, in addition to beauty, I would invoke awe and wonder.
Sure, of course. Yeah.
I think that it's impossible to separate those things phenomenologically in those kinds of experiences and situations that people have, including science. In science, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
exactly.
you read Einstein, writing about the worldview that he has as a scientist, and some of his own experiences in thinking about his scientific work. You read historical scientific figures throughout history, and they all express, or many of them express, this sense of awe and wonder and amazement and a feeling of the good, transformative insight. And I think there's a deep connection. So I'm really going to lay my cards on the table, because I know I can do that with you.
Yes.
But I mean, for me, I'm very much drawn to mysticism as a mode of understanding what's happening there. I think of science and mysticism as deeply linked throughout history in philosophical, cultural, and personality ways in terms of individual scientists, where mysticism is this. I think of mysticism almost as a kind of epistemic humility. It's that the world is vast, it's unfathomable, and that there are modes of knowing is not even the right word. There are modes of being in which there is a felt oneness or unity that can be expressed in innumerably different ways in science, in art, in philosophy, and mysticism. So going back to the sacred, I think of it as a kind of the need for a kind of immanent mysticism, a mysticism of the here and now in this planet, with the needs that face us as a species and as a civilization, as a scientific civilization. So I see the mystic as really almost the guardian, the reminderer, the sort of watch person for that sensibility.
Well, I think that I agree with that quite deeply. A lot of my work is about trying to get these two to speak together. And in your own book, The Blind Spot, I was noting the many places where you explained why this was chosen by the scientists, especially in the history chapter, because it was elegant, because it was beautiful, because it was simple. I mean, there's a problem with the notion of simple. We act as if it's a cleanly determinable thing, but it's not, right? And stuff like that. But there was this tremendous sense of how much that is driving, motivating, and justifying the moves that these scientists are making historically.
And even as people have written about, just to balance things, that can sometimes lead us astray. We can get caught up in the beauty of the mathematical constructions in a way where we lose contact with how the world actually is talking back to us, and we depart from any real possibility of experiential grounding or confirmation or support. I mean, this happens. So I'm Marcelo and Adam could talk much more articulately about this, but this happens in areas of physics, in string theory, or
Yeah,
the
yeah,
many
yeah,
worlds interpretation of quantum
yeah, yeah.
mechanics, and how people just are willing to run with its metaphysical implications in this sort of profligate and indiscriminate way. So that's sort of the flip side: is you can get fascinated by constructions that have a kind of beauty, but that are misleading in certain ways.
For sure, for sure. Um, it's interesting that maybe we'll leave to when they're present to talk about this more in depth. But you can see sort of both of these impulses, right? You can get the rabbit holing that goes on with strings theory and multiple worlds, and it's just one electron moving all through time and space, encountering itself. And like, what? How could you possibly determine that or give empirical content of that claim? Um, um, uh, and then, but the other, like, there is something, and I hear that maybe I'll be poetic. The whisper of the mystic in this drive to unify the very, very bottom with the very, very top, the relativity with quantum. And it's like, if there was ever a falsification of Popper, there's a falsification. We've had the best minds and the best technique, and they keep making this hypothesis, and it keeps getting reliably disconfirmed, and that doesn't matter. They just keep going, and they just keep going.
Right.
And I think that's powerful. Yeah, I wouldn't want to. I'm very I try to make a distinction between the wisdom that mysticism can give us and any particular ontological or epistemological knowledge claims that are made. And the first, I think, I take very seriously. The second, I greet with quite a bit of suspicion.
Right.
And I think that's important. Well, I just want to I want to wrap up for today. And I think this was great. We're really unpacking things really nicely, very dialogically, the way I like. I want to talk to you next time, just to forewarn. I want to talk to you about these issues, um, uh, about abstraction, and you make a wonderful correction, or at least amendment. I can't remember, is it the end of chapter 1 or chapter 2? You talk about, well, you say, actually, we mean more or less abstract or more or less concrete, because the terms are actually relative and comparative, right? The dog is more abstract than the Cocker Spaniel, but the mammal is more abstract than the dog, and right, and all that sort of thing. And I want to unpack that a little bit more. And how does that plug into this notion of more real, as you're more closer to the inexhaustible fount of intelligibility? And then there's this other one about, direct experience, immediate, pure experience. And, and then you're familiar with this, no doubt. These are criticisms made by others against people like Nishida and the Kyoto schools. Hegelians would make this argument. Right. What do you mean? There's all experience is mediated. That's the gain from the Kantian revolution.
Right.
That's the thing you're doing, where you're trying to go back before Kant. You're giving up the realization that everything is mediated in some fashion, and there's no such thing as immediate experience or direct experience. Right. And does that sound like a fecund area to go into it next?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, immediate is like abstract concrete. It's, there's
exactly.
There's a contextual issue there as to what mediate versus immediate means, just as there is for abstract concrete. But yeah, no, those are all important things to talk about. Definitely. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, Evan, first of all, I'm going to thank you. This has been just fantastic.
Thanks.
I had great expectations and it exceeded them. I really enjoyed myself a lot. I hope you did.
Yeah, definitely. Lots of fun.
And I definitely want you back. Let's have the next one just be you and I again.
Okay.
And then maybe you could reach out to your co-authors and we could set up maybe a third and fourth with all of us together.
Yeah.
We might need a little bit more time for those episodes, just to give more space for more people to be able to chime in. But I always like to give my, this from when you were on the philosophy of meditation, we like to give the people here the last word. It can be provocative, it can be summative, it can be mysteriously evocative, whatever you want it to be.
I don't know if I have a last word of that nature, other than just to say it's always lots of fun to talk with you, and I've really enjoyed the conversation. Yeah.
All right, so then I'll give the last word. I'm going to plug the book again.
Great,
Okay,
thanks.
really, this book, if you are interested in the meaning crisis, if you're interested in, well, relevance realization, that's in the book
Yeah,
too.
yeah.
If you're interested in all of these issues where we're talking about the sacred, about, you know, the fact that somehow we need to be put back into the scientific worldview, but that means changing what we mean by a scientific worldview. And you should be interested if you're watching this video, because I've been talking about those things for 5 years, at least in this space, and I don't know, 20 years at the university. So you should definitely buy the book. Again, very clearly written, accessible without being a dumbing down. It's a nice stepping down without being a dumbing down. I highly recommend the book. Go out and get it. It's not expensive. It's a great read. And thank you very much again, Evan. Just a great pleasure.
Thank you.